Alright, let's talk about this problem. So they have a graph here, and they tell us that that graph shows the supply and demand for Japanese-made automobiles in the U.S. Assume that these Japanese-made and U.S.-made automobiles are the same quality, considered to be perfect substitutes. So a person is just as happy with a Japanese car as they are with an American car. Perfect substitutes. So then we're supposed to suppose that the U.S. government imposes a tariff on Japanese automobiles. Now, remember what a tariff is, right? So it's basically like a tax. If a Japanese automobile comes into the U.S., it's going to be extra tax on it. So what's that going to do to Japanese-made automobiles? Is that going to change the supply, or is it going to change the demand? Who's the tax on? So that's the first question we have to ask. The tariff is actually applied on the person who ships the cars to the U.S., right? So it's not that the consumer, the buyer, is going to be paying the tariff. It's that the seller, the supplier, is going to be paying this tax just to ship their cars to the U.S. So what's that going to do? It's kind of, you can think about from the perspective of the supplier, the Japanese automobile maker. Now it costs more for me to send a car to the U.S. because there's an extra tax on me when I try to send a car to the U.S., which means I'm probably going to send fewer cars to the U.S. So what that does, it doesn't change whether the American person wants more or less Japanese cars, right? I don't care as the American consumer whether the Japanese car maker is being taxed or not. I still might want the car. So the demand isn't really changing. What changes here is the supply, because it's the person who's shipping the car that's now being taxed for shipping that car. So because they're taxed, probably means they're going to send fewer. It makes sense, right? It costs me more to send it. I'm not going to send it. So for our first question here, suppose that the government imposes a tariff on the Japanese-made automobiles. Use the line drawing tool and show the effect on the Japanese market and properly label your line. So I'm going to click the little magnifying glass here to open up my graph. And just like we just talked through, if the supplier is being taxed to send something to the U.S., they're probably going to send less, which means we're going to decrease the supply. And on the graph, the way that always looks, anytime you decrease something, you move the line to the left, right? So we're moving it down to the left, over. So we're decreasing supply, which means I'm going to decrease this supply line. It's going to move to the left. So I'm going to click the little line tool here, and I'm going to draw myself a line that is to the left of the supply line I started with. Okay, so I'm going to draw a supply line. So it's going to look the same direction as the first S line. It's just going to be shifted to the left. And then it wants me to label it, so I click the little question marks here and say that's my new supply, S1. All right, does that make sense? So there's a tariff, there's a tax on the supplier just to send their car to the U.S. That means the supplier is going to supply fewer cars. So the supply line shifts to the left. It shifts down, gets smaller, however you want to think about it. But it always, if it decreases, it means we shift it to the left. So my new supply line is here to the left of my old supply line. The next thing it wants me to do is use the point tool to identify the new equilibrium. Remember, the equilibrium is just where the supply and the demand line cross. Remember, the tariff didn't do anything to my demanders because my U.S. people who want to buy a car, I don't care. If I want to buy a car, I don't care if my supplier paid tax on it or not. So my demand hasn't changed. The only thing that changed was the supply. So we still have the same old demand line. We just have the new supply line. And we want to find the equilibrium. It's where those two cross. So I'll put the dot here, and it wants me to label it, so I'll click the little question marks and say that's my new equilibrium. That's E1, my new equilibrium. And then I'll click Save, check my answer, well done. There we go. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, let me know. We can talk about it again, or you can come to office hours anytime, and we can talk back and forth, and you can ask your questions as we go through the question. The last little piece of this question, though, it says, because of the tariff, the price of the Japanese-made cars rises and the quantity falls, which you can see by comparing the sorry, I was trying to get up the tool to write on my page here, but I guess it didn't work. Compare the old equilibrium where this was the price and this was the quantity, and now we've shifted our supply line, and our new equilibrium shows we have a higher price. You just follow that dotted line across to the price, the vertical price axis, and our price went up from the black line to the blue line, and it shows we have a lower quantity. If you come down to the horizontal axis where we see the quantity of Japanese-made automobiles, our quantity shifted left from the black line to the blue line. So the price increased and the quantity decreased, which is what it tells us here, as a result of the tariff. So in this market for American-made cars, there will be what? If the price of my Japanese cars goes up, and I don't care, I like an American car just as much as I like a Japanese car, then I, as the buyer, the demander now, am going to prefer an American car, right? Because it's cheaper, because the price of the Japanese cars went up. So we'll have an increase in demand for American cars now because the price of the Japanese car has gone up, right? So people are going to want to buy the American car because it's cheaper. So that gives me an increase in demand for the American cars, and thus the price of American cars will what? So now we go back to our graph and look at what would happen if I increased demand here. So to increase it means to shift it to the right, right? So I can imagine drawing a demand curve out here to the right of the old demand curve, and what happens then to the price? If I draw a new demand curve to the right of the old one, and I keep my old supply line, so the red supply line still is what we're dealing with for the American cars, what happens though? Now my equilibrium, if I have a new demand line out here, it's going to cross the supply line up here somewhere, and my equilibrium price, again, has increased. See that? So if we go over to the price axis, now it's higher than it used to be because my demand shifted out for American cars. So when the increase in demand for American cars, the American cars will increase in price, so the price will rise, and what happens also to the quantity that's sold. If you look at the same thing, imagine that demand line out here, and where it crosses that supply line, and come down to the quantity that's sold on the horizontal axis, and you can see that it increases as well. So it goes from the black line up to a new imaginary line here for the new demand line. So the price will go up as well as the number of cars that Americans sell. And in fact, this is the reason that the American government might do something like imposing a tariff on the Japanese car makers, because it actually helps the U.S. car makers. Not only do they sell more cars now of the American ones, but they also sell them for a higher price. So the American car makers are much better off now because the U.S. government has imposed this tax on the Japanese car makers, which helps the American car makers. So that's really the reason that a tariff even would exist as far as like in the policy world and politics and things. It's just exactly because of this economics principle. Hope that helps. If you need more, again, shoot me another question by email, or it actually might help if you can make it to office hours, and we can chat about it and you can ask questions as I go.